Welcome back to Master Reading Theatre. Here we have In the World of the Jaredites. The Problem 1. A Twilight World. My dear Professor F., I warned you that you would find the Book of Mormon full of strange and puzzling things. Please don't hesitate to tell me what you think. Above all, there is no need to be concerned about offending my religious sensibilities. The Book of Mormon is tough. It thrives on investigation. You may kick it around like a football, as many have done, and I promise you it will wear you out long before you ever make a dent in it. As to your first objection, you say that you are disturbed by the apparent attempt of the Book of Mormon to trace the origin of our Indian tribes to a single city in the Near East and to a time as recent as 600 BC. This would seem to you to be a much too simple and limited explanation for everything. It seems so to me, too. But since you have only begun your reading of the Book of Mormon, my urgent advice to you is read on. There is a great surprise awaiting you in the next to last book. Far from being oversimplified, this strange history is extremely varied and complicated. As you know, the missionaries in the early days of the church recommended the Book of Mormon to the world as a history of the Indians, Indians being one of the few subjects on which Americans in general possessed some information, and on which their interest could be easily aroused. But a matter of fact, the Book of Mormon is not so much a history of the Indians as their distant ancestors, people as different from them in many things as our Anglo-Saxon forefathers are from us. The story of the Indians only begins where the Book of Mormon ends. Before that, it deals largely with those great city-building nations of the South, about whom you know so much more than I do. But before the Book of Mormon ever approaches your glamorous field, it has a good deal to say about another culture, one that has been much studied in our day, and can still be examined at first hand, namely of all things that the desert Arabs, which is brought before our eyes in 1 Nephi with a vividness and clarity which, I believe, say much for the authenticity of its record. The same book also gives us a glimpse into the life of the prosperous and civilized Jews at Jerusalem in the days of Zedekiah, briefer but no less clear and specific than the picture of life in the desert. Already, you see, this remarkable document offers to impart information on no less than 4 widely divergent cultures. I leave it to you whether an accurate description of any one of them, with the possible exception of some Indian tribes, would have been possible from the source materials available in the days of Joseph Smith. But it is to the culture number 5 that I would now call your attention. The last history, so the 4 that he's talking about must have been the Arabs, the Jews, Lehi, the Bedouins, all those, and then number 5. The last history in the Book of Mormon, which goes under the title of the Book of Ether, is even more wonderful, in my opinion, than the first. It takes us to the twilight world of proto-history, where the dim, half-described shadow empires of Asia are only in our day beginning to take on recognizable form. As you know, my constitutional weakness for whatever is vague and fuzzy has drawn me irresistibly to the dangerous area, and I have been guilty of a number of lengthy articles on matters that sensible people hold to be unsearchable. You are free to laugh at this, but if you think I am trespassing, what would you say if a man who tried to give an account of life that prehistoric world from which was known of it 120 years ago? With the same unfaltering and unhurried step that led us across the sands of Arabia, and you must agree that it was marvelous performance, the author of the Book of Mormon now conducts us to a world so remote, so utterly different from anything within the scope of the biblical or classical student, that if we would follow him, we must acquire a whole new gear and tackle for the journey. I think we are agreed that it would take a great deal of training for anyone to acquire the background necessary to compose First Nephi. Now imagine any man insane enough to try, after such colossal exertions, to write another such story of equal length and detail, but this time about a totally different race of people living in an age far removed from the other, and is a wholly different geographical setting. As far as I know, not even Joseph Smith ever called anyone's attention to this prodigious feat. Or as Jonah Barnes would say, he just drops these gems. We all take it for granted, yet you will soon see that the author of Ether could have obtained precious little help from any materials in writing First Nephi. On the contrary, the former experience could only tend to embarrass any attempt at a new history, which would call for an entirely new training and preparation. What the author of Ether has to supply is not a new plot, but all new props and scenery. Every century sees its wars, treaties, migrations, and so forth, but always in a different setting, so that the test of an historical document lies, as we have so often insisted, not in the story it tells, but in the casual details that only an eyewitness can have seen. The story of Jared and the story of Lehi have the same theme, the familiar one of the righteous man who leads his people out of a doomed and wicked world. There is nothing original in that. It is also the story of Noah, Enoch, Abraham, Moses, the church in the wilderness, and, for that matter, the restored church. But what a setting! And what strange institutions and practices! How shall we ever be able to check up on such recondite stuff? It is going to require a bit of doing, and so I would advise you to prepare yourself for a long siege. Number 2, the method. As you know, it is my unfortunate habit either to write appallingly long letters, 20 pages yet, or none at all. Since you have set this off by accusing the Book of Mormon of proposing an oversimplified story of the Indians, I am not going to let go of your throbbing wrist until, Hamlet-like, I have forced you to look upon a number of strange and disturbing pictures. Had the Jaredites lived in a vacuum, their story would today be beyond the reach of criticism. But they did not live in a vacuum. The Book of Ether tells us that they continued in the New World the customs and vices that had flourished in the Old. If, then, we can only find out what people were up to in the homeland at that early day, we will have our control for the Ether story. That, as you will recall, is the way we handled the problem of Lehi in the desert. Found out what was going on in the world that Nephi was supposed to be describing, then compared the data with what Nephi had to tell us. The task of checking up on Lehi's activities was greatly simplified by the fact that the Bedouins of Arabia do things in our day much as they did them in his. What we find in Central Asia, Jared's country, are customs equally stable. But I can hear you snorting. What about the evidence? It is one thing, I will admit, to read Arabic, and another to lisp the chaste Mongolian. From the isolation of Utah, it is not possible to do more than skim the top of our materials. But if you will hasten to consult the bibliographies of such standard works as McGovern and Vernadsky, you will see that even they have hardly done more. Until someone appears who is competent to deal with these difficult documents, a classist who is also a sinologist, an Indiologian, an expert on Semitic, Turkish, Slavic, and whatnot, in short, another Vamri, we must be content to base our speculations on the limited materials within our control. Our whole justification is that these are adequate, as in the case of Lehi, to prove what we want to prove, no more.
Thank you.
Kitty brought in on a UFO?
Yes.
And what are we going to prove? That certain strange and unfamiliar things described in Ether actually could have taken place, as described, because they actually did take place. Characteristically and repeatedly, in those very cultural areas in which, according to the Book of Mormon, the Jaredites acquired their culture and civilization. And what are those materials to which we have been so darkly alluding? They come in periods to illustrate. Let us say that there is a peculiar custom of the royal court, or the hunt, for example, described in Ether. We find the same customs described by modern travelers in Central Asia. Source number 1. Christian and Muslim merchants, geographers, and missionaries report of the same peculiar customs in the same region in the Middle Ages. Source number 2. Next, we move back another 700 or 800 years, and behold, the spies and ambassadors of the Byzantine court describe the same customs. Source number 3. And so on, for which we are now beginning to feel a measure of respect. Moving back through the centuries, we find that classical historians, from Cassiodorus to Herodotus, a full 1,000 years apart, mention the same customs, and then slipping back another 1,500 to 2,000 years, we read about it as the records of the Assyrians and Babylonians. And last of all, the Russian archaeologists find evidence for the same thing in prehistoric times. From these many points of reference, we may find project, as it were, a smooth curve right back to the Jaredites, and safely assume that when the Book of Ether describes the very institutions depicted in these records of early Asia, it is on solid ground. In each instance, however, you will have to be the judge, for we all can give at present interval is a sampling of the evidence. You may have to wait 30 years for the rest of it. Please note that we are limiting our curiosity to the sort of thing that happened. An anediction, so to say. The exact time and place of any specific event are no concern of ours. Such matters are always open to dispute, and in the case of the Jaredites, they don't begin to come within guessing distance. Bear in mind that these people lived in a realm far removed from the current of world history. In a dateless age, they took their culture from the common source, and thereafter were on their own until they disappeared from the earth. What difference whether they had a battle in one spot or another, in one year or another? The important thing is that they did have battles, and for our purposes, that those battles followed patterns of warfare particular to Central Asia. We specialize in patterns. So, you can see he is sidestepping specifically the problem of specific dates and locations, because the idea is that will always be disputed for whatever reason by whatever academic is on hand. On the other hand, that ignores the entirety of the point where it says, yeah, but this thing happened, because we can see that it has happened in the past, and we can see that there's plenty of evidence for that. Section 3. Conflicting patterns of history. The first chapter of our text gives us warning not to be dogmatic about chronology. 3 times in the genealogical list of 30 names running back to the Great Tower, the word descendant occurs in place of son. See Ether 1:6 and also verse 16 and 23. As you know, in Hebrew and other languages, son and descendant are both rendered by one very common word. One and the same word describes a modern Jew and Father Isaac as sons of Abraham. The word is understood differently in each case, but is not written differently. A person confined to a written text would have no means of knowing when ben, B-E-N, the word, should be taken to mean son in a literal sense, and when it means merely descendant. An ancient Hebrew knows perfectly well when to make the distinction. Like the Arabs and Maoris, they kept their records in their heads, and in mentioning a particular patriarch, it was assumed that the hero was familiar with his line down to his next important descendant, and written lists being a mere outline to establish connections between particular outlines. The name of a patriarch was enough to indicate his line, which did not have to be written about in full. Sir Leonard Woolley had some interesting things to say on this subject in the Book of Abraham. Now, Ether proves, at least to Latter-day Saints, that son and descendant were both used in the ancient genealogies, which thus do not present an unbroken father-to-son relationship. We are told that the genealogy in Ether belongs to the second part of a record, that the first part of this record is had among the Jews. Ether 1:3. So, we may regard the Old Testament genealogies as the earlier part of this same list, and are thus faced with the possibility, long suspected by many, that in biblical genealogies, Ben must have sometimes been read son, and sometimes descendant, though men have long since lost the knowledge that enabled the ancient ruler to make the necessary distinction. The result is, of course, that our biblical genealogies, as we read them today, may be much too short. I did not know that. So, first thing I've learned from the world of the Jaredites is that when we talk about genealogies in the Bible, and it says Solomon ben David ben ben the word ben could also mean descendant instead of just direct son. And so, yeah, interesting. It means that we really could have a much shorter genealogy than we normally should have. Anyway, incidentally, the genealogy in Ether, chapter 1, explains why neither the brother of Jared nor his children are ever named. We're not even told how many sons he had, though Jared's own sons are listed by name. This one's puzzled me, since the brother of Jared is by all odds the most important character in the book. It is, of course, because he that wrote this is a direct descendant of Jared. See Ether 1, verse 2, and also verse 32. And not of Jared's brother, and is giving a history of his own line only. To get involved in Andre's 88 version of the flood story, or the 64 conflicting accounts of the dispersion listed by von Schwartz, might jeopardize the terseness and brevity that give our little notes their gem-like quality. Let us consign such matters to their decent obscurity of a footnote. Huh. Yeah, it's literally just a footnote about the books they're talking about. As long as you insist on having the evidence for everything, by the way, you cannot object to an occasional reference in small print. The trouble with the Babel story is that we are told so little. A few short, enigmatic verses in Genesis are not enough in themselves to justify dogmatic reconstructions and wild summaries that have raged about the tower. Ether has the support of the latest conclusions based on Genesis chapter 10, that when the tower was built, the people had already spread abroad in the earth after the deluge for some time. This is interesting that all accounts are very vague as to where the human family lived before the flood. The best versions of that, of Barosius, reporting that the flood survivors are lost and have to be told by divine revelation where they are. When our source describes a part, that's interesting. Wait, that was one of the arguments that they had? It's interesting that all accounts are very vague as to where the human family lived before the flood. The best version that of Barosius, they're lost and they have to be told by divine revelation where they are. That's interesting. Well, in the Apocrypha, Jonah Barnes mentions that there are apocryphal writings that specifically say that where they landed is very far from Eden. And where Eden is very far from where Noah landed. And so they could be, there's no problem with it being in Jackson County, Missouri. Which, you know what's funny is for the longest time, as a kid, I was always kind of incredulous of that. I was kind of like, really? Garden of Eden? Jackson County, Missouri? Missouri? Because all this stuff that everyone centers the Bible in, like, if you go back to I don't know how historical it is, but a lot of people say, oh, well, the Garden of Eden just must be over in the Middle East as well. because they figure everything else happens over in the Middle East, then why not the Garden of Eden? Wouldn't it be just in that Fertile Crescent area? Good heavens, why not? That's the weird thing. When you actually read the Book of Mormon and you read the Bible, you get the sense that there are certain things that are truly actual, that you're like, wait, that's not really, really? Wow. One of those is that the flood was probably a global flood. And so if, the Garden of Eden and where they lived was all in Missouri, yeah, you'd need a global flood to get you over to Mount Ararat in the Middle East. That one's a really big deal. And there's a lot of things that really tend towards that way when you read the Book of Mormon like that. And the same thing is that the Tower of Babel is very real. That the people were starting to speak in different languages and tongues, and no one could figure it out, and so Jared and his brothers skedaddled. And so you've got two major things where you're like, really? Or maybe it was the Pearl of Great Price, because Lehi and his family is 600 BC, whereas the Jaredites are after the flood. So it must be the Pearl of Great Price. As you read it, it affirms the idea of a global flood. And if you believe that the Book of Mormon happened in the Americas, and you also believe that Joseph Smith's a prophet, there's a string of information that put me back around and reinforced it from forward to back instead of back to forward. Because one way is that you just sit there and say, well, Joseph Smith's a prophet, and he said it, so that's got to be true. And I was always like, are we sure on that one? Like, I know the Book of Mormon's true. I know he's a prophet. But I was always kind of like, really? And then later on I read a lot more books about, boy, howdy, was he a prophet? And yeah, lots of stuff he said definitely came true. And more importantly, these extracurricular books about the Apocrypha and all this other stuff, it's like, it becomes much more vivid. It's like, no, really, he really, really, really was a prophet. And if he really, really, really was a prophet, why in the world would there be any problem? Followed by which, then you've got Jonah Barnes pointing it out, and then you've got, there's one other thing. There was other physical evidences from the Heartland. People who are Heartlanders, instead of Mesoamerican kind of people who believe where the Book of Mormon happened, they pointed out certain things that I'm like, oh, good golly, that makes a lot of sense. And it just came together. And that's why I, even though as a kid I always thought of it as Mesoamerica, that Heartland idea really, really has struck my fancy. Now, could I be wrong? Sure. That's fine. It does not take away from all the spiritual truths that Jesus Christ is the God of the whole, God of the whole world and Savior to us all. So, all right, let's continue on. As long as you insist on having the evidences for everything, by the way, you cannot object to an occasional reference in small print. The trouble with the Babel story is that we are told so little. A few short enigmatic verses, wild summaries of the tower. Ether has the support of the latest conclusions based on Genesis chapter 10, that when the tower was built, the people had already been spread abroad in the earth after the deluge for some time. It's interesting that all accounts are very vague as to where the human family lived before the flood. The best version of that, flood survivors lost, they need a divine revelation where they were. Well, yeah, if you're half a world away, yeah, I'd say so. When our source describes a particular region as that quarter where there never had men been, Ether 2:5, the implication is that men had certainly been in other quarters. Moreover, Jared's people were reluctant to leave their homes when they were finally driven out of the land. They took with them flocks, herds, and seeds of every kind, together with the knowledge and skills. They even took books with them, necessary to establish a great civilization. all things being the necessary products of a long-established and widespread economy. Civilization meets us full-blown, nay, decadent in the pages of Ether. One looks in vain for any sign of evolution in the Book of Mormon. This is a red rag to the social scientists, I know, but that is only because social scientists don't read the historical documents, which, if they only knew, are the inexhaustible field notes and lab notes of the human race. To those who view the world comes from the questionnaires and textbooks, it seems incredible that the early dynastic civilizations of Sumer, for example, should be so far ahead of later cultures that, compared with it, everything that comes later seems almost decadent. The handicrafts must have reached an astounding perfection. It is hard to believe that the great Babylonian civilization, throughout the many centuries in which it flourished, was merely coasting, sponging off the achievements of a much earlier civilization, which by all rights should have been primitive. Yet that is exactly the picture that Messier gives us in his great study, which is the book Babylonien und Assyrien. I guess it's Germanish. It's a book. It is against the rules that those artistic attainments for which Egypt is most noted, the matchless portraits, the wonderful stone vessels, the exquisite weaving, should reach their peak at the very dawn of Egyptian history, in the pre-dynastic period, yet such is the case. It is the earliest dynasties, and not in the later ones, that technical perfection and artistic taste of the Egyptians in jewelry, furniture, ceramics, etc., are most advanced. Here is a very odd thing. A British authority recently commented, in literature, the best in each kind comes suddenly. In literature, the best in each kind comes first, comes suddenly, and never comes again. This is a disturbing, uncomfortable, unacceptable idea to people who take their doctrine of evolution over simply. Ooh, okay, so yeah, he is gouging the idea of how we commonly think of civilizations. We think of civilizations being small and primitive and then growing into bigger things. Perfect example, think of the idea of cavemen. We always think of them as these big hulking brutes who are extremely hairy with big foreheads and eyebrows, clubbing women on their head and dragging them back to a cave. And that they speak in half language, or grunts. Really? You think so? Look at the cavemen that they've found in caves, or the ancient people. Look at the people who've been preserved in the Andes Mountains, in the mummies of Egypt, in the Iceman up in the Alpines that they found. They had full-on civilizations: flutes, instruments, buttons, satchels, shepherds. They were full on there. And yeah, he is really digging it in, because if you think about it, there's a recent YouTube short, because we all know that those can be very true, but there's the statistic that Cleopatra is closer to the moon landings than she was to when the pyramids were made. That there was actually the ancient Egyptian archaeologist as a job in ancient Egypt. It's how long they've been around. And we've had reconstructions of what the pyramids were supposed to have looked like, with smooth limestone white sides and basically a jeweled top kind of thing, and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, he's pointing out that, look, a lot of these civilizations were friggin' fantastic. And then the civilizations after have been running on fumes. I think he might be right. I mean, if you look, it's just, yeah. But I think it must be admitted to be true. Of the very greatest things in each sort of literature, the masterpiece is unprecedented, unique, never challenged or approached henceforth. More impressive is the report that Egyptologist Siegfried Schott, time and again in the development of the Egyptian culture, the monuments of a new epic presents something hitherto unknown. Sorry, I'm distracted by this idea. I'm going to reread what I was just reading. But I'm distracted by the idea of, he's specifically talking about literature. But that can be said for a lot of different things. And in literature, this is also very true. Because in the end, for example, my sister, she's an author. She's written stuff, and it's actually gained a lot of traction. She's been self-published for a very long period of time. But she has come to really, really, really hate a method or systemology of telling stories, which is called Save the Cat, which has been taught in academia now for probably a couple of decades about this is how you write screenplays, this is how you write popular stories, and you see it all over the place. Good guy comes in and does something nice so that you know that person's a good guy, and bad guy comes in and kicks the dog so you know that guy is the bad guy, and that you have these certain story beats to make a very successful story, and it gets you published, and it gets you money. And it gets you a very formulaic way of telling stories. And this is what we see constantly and all the time in Hollywood. And so she comes to really hate this type of structure. And to be sure, there is a lot of sense in following the structure. And there are a lot of stories that break that are really, really good. And so the question then becomes, all right, why is it if you break this structure, or you go to a time and place before that story structure ever was made, what made the story good? You better analyze it and figure it out, because if you're going to break the way and tropes that have established what people like, you better have a good way of explaining why it's so good. For example, there's a writing trope that, oh, I woke up on this morning and I looked at myself in the mirror with my and then you get the description of the protagonist, followed by which it's, you go on to the different story beats of here's the day and here's how the whole world was turned upside down, and they didn't really want to go, but they felt forced into it, and so they accepted the call to arms, etc. And that's fine. Those are archetypes, and those are good. But it will follow this structure if you've got it right and you got it going well, or have certain structures in it. But you have to understand that this pattern has been around for such a long time. It's become so diffuse. We are pretty much just living on fumes of saying this exact same type of story over and over again, but with just different time, place, and people. So the question then becomes, when we have a new literary breakthrough that makes the pattern, for example, everyone said that I have read about, after they talk about their adventure, they say, we're all writing our own Robinson Crusoes. So for everyone who wrote that adventure survival, they were all inspired by Robinson Crusoe. And of course they made their own adventure story. I tend to think that the first and original is extremely important. And that, yeah, you do live off the fumes of that, but in many ways it becomes its own thing. It becomes its own honing idea that this was the great and classic one. But it can still evolve over time, but it is a big shot in the dark and explosion in the middle of nowhere that no one anticipated that becomes huge and amazing. So, if we apply that to civilizations as well, this is what we're getting. I appreciate you listening to my tangents. More impressive is the report of the Egyptologist Siegfried Schott. Time and again in the development of the Egyptian culture, the monuments of a new epic present something heretofore unknown in a state of completely developed perfection. He lists as such items the sudden appearance of the pyramid texts, the surprising emergence of temple architecture and its mural decorations without any prior forms to indicate an earlier development. The buildings of Zoser at Saqqara, the great pyramids themselves, and the temple reliefs, which display a complete mastery of medium and style on their first appearance. Are not the earliest paintings of the human race to this day unexcelled? Please note that we are only able to pass judgment on those things which have happened and survived from those remote ages. We assume that those people were crude and primitive in all other things, until some of those other things turn up and show them to be far ahead of us. And the Indus Valley civilization, the Sumer civilization, as they mentioned. Anyway, we must admit, for example, that the stone chipping of certain Paleolithic hunters has never been equaled since their day. It's taken a long time for us to even reconstruct something that would be similar to how they made it. So it happens that stone implements are all that have survived from those people. Have we any right to deny them perfection of other things? Is there any reason for supposing that their wood or leather work was inferior? Anyone with a modern education will tell you without hesitation that the earliest weaving, our ancestors must have been very crude indeed. But when, contrary to all expectations, some of the cloth is actually found, the French experts gave it careful examination and declare it the equal of the very finest stuff we are capable of producing today. The only weapons that have survived from prehistoric times are far more suited. Yeah, like again, it's, you think of cavemen and you think of them in their just like loose leopard skin over one shoulder and a thick club, and they are not good at anything else. You're like, really? But yet, here they actually find, oh yeah, they have all these tools. Oh wait, no, they have like regular clothes and winter clothes and other stuff. What makes you, it always bothers me. We always think of them as knuckle-dragging, forehead-sloped club slingers, when it's just can't be the case. Anyway. The only weapons, yep, footnotes are just references to the books he's talking about. The only weapons that have survived from prehistoric times are far more suited for their purpose than a modern rifle. The deadliest of all hunting weapons remains, to this day, the stone-headed, not steel-headed arrow. In my recent labors on the marked arrows, I had occasion to assemble an impressive amount of evidence on this head. Eyre, E-Y-R-E, Eyre, has recently supplied a good deal of evidence to prove that our primitive ancestors enjoyed a good deal more security, comfort, and pleasure in life than we do. Moreover, as an anthropologist, you know perfectly well that backward and primitive people may have mental powers equaling or excelling our own. Look at Elkin's Australian Aborigines, or if they are too far away, I can lead you to some Indians who in some things can make us feel like Cretans. If it would not take us too far afield, I could show you that the dogma of evolutionary advancement of the human race as a whole is nothing but an impressive diploma which the 19th century awarded summa cum laude to itself. Modern man is a self-certified genius who, having pinned the blue ribbon on his own lapel, proceeds to hand out all other awards according to the various candidates are more or less like him. Yes, I can hear you say, but there must have been a long evolution behind all these early achievements, which is for you to prove, not assume, if you are a scientist. What is certain, to date, is A, that their evolutionary background has not been discovered, and B, that there is no record of subsequent improvement through all these thousands of years. So let the biologists talk of evolution. For the historian, it has no meaning. Indeed, Professor Van der Meer, perhaps the foremost living student of ancient chronology, can only regret the influence of a theory evolutionism which has been dragged so unfortunately into the study of ancient history. Yep, I'd agree with that, and I'll tell you why in a moment. By now, imagine that I've got you in such a state that you would refuse to read farther, even if I had the time to write more. I leave you now with a promise of committing attractions, pending your willingness to carry on the discussion. Be so good as to indicate your reactions to all these words, and I shall conduct myself accordingly. So it looks like this was made off of a big giant letter he wrote to his colleague. But here's my thing, specifically. There was a really good video that was put out around the time of, like, a year after Black Panther came out, and it was put together by a student who was talking about how Wakanda would truly be impossible, not just because it's great fictional, but he explains that if you look at all the great big city centers that accumulated mass and wealth and culture, technology, and more, it was all done in the areas where there was center of trade. Egypt, center of trade. Later on, the Greeks and the Romans, center of trade. Earlier on, Babylonia and Assyria, centers of trade. And all these places had, access to being able to trade with their neighbors. They had ports. They did not cut themselves off. Any civilization that was cut off from any other part lost technologies because it wasn't needed. He brought up, he was apparently Australian, his own, the anthropology that they found in Tasmania. Okay, Tasmania is the little island that is further south than Australia. It looks like it's kind of like a broken off piece of Australia. And they said that the technology that was had by the early Tasmanians was greater than when the natural Tasmanians had at the time that, colonists arrived and anthropologists started documenting stuff. And so he said, they had technology, and they lost it because of their isolation. To continue to get, receive, upgrade, and do more with technology, you need to have competition and you need to have trade. And so that's why he was saying Wakanda couldn't work, because if they were isolationists, they would have gone down in technology. You can also see a more larger example of that in when China cut off all contact with the outer world. And because, they had been the bee's knees advanced civilization for the longest time. They stayed that way, and they stayed stagnant especially after they had become stagnant in their traditions and their culture. And when they cut themselves off from the world, and the whole world advanced past them, there's another good example. So where you have trade, you have advancement. Where you have competition, you have advancement. And so when they sit there and say, this idea of evolutionary history being dragged into, the idea of evolution, which is biology, dragged into history, it doesn't prove itself out well. Because we have these sudden, huge advancements in civilization, where entire regions and epochs and eras are defined by a new and sudden explosion of this is the way it's going to be. And then, it continues for a long time until finally someone else says, nope, this is going to be the way it's going to be. And it's big and huge and comes on the scene, just making a huge difference. And so there's not exactly a huge, a gentle, slow lead up. It's just a bam, here it is, and there it goes. And I add to that the idea that if you have isolationism, you eventually lead to decline. I think that was well argued. But I think that also depends on cultural influences. Because China, ancient China, stayed in its position for a long time. All right, next is the Tower. Let me see how long this is. Yeah, let's go with that. It's not too long. The Tower. Dear Professor F, in reply to my sustained blast of the 17th INST, I'm not sure what his abbreviation is for that. In my reply to my sustained blast of the 17th instance, you tax me with a naive and gullible acceptance of the Tower of Babel story. I knew you would. Most people believe quite naively that Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address, but their totally uncritical acceptance of the fact does not prevent it from being true. You may accept any story naively, or you may take it critically. What would you say if I were to accuse you of being very simple and gullible in rejecting the story of the Tower? The cornerstone of sound scholarship in our day is the comfortable doctrine that the answer no can never be quite as wrong as the answer yes, a proposition which, to my knowledge, has never been demonstrated. I'm going to back this up with a very specific thing. For the longest time, anthropologists thought the stories of Native Americans shooting one arrow up in the air and then shooting like 20 more arrows before the first one hit the ground as impossible exaggeration. Or they took these tapestries from the medieval times showing the men shooting their bows and arrows from the hip instead of up near our face like we have. And they had their quivers at their hip instead of on their back like we have in movies, right? You watch Lord of the Rings with Orlando Bloom as, Elf Boy, come on, Legolas. And they have to speed up the film to show him going, shafoom, 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 right? There was a guy who learned to reconstruct how they shot arrows from the medieval tapestries. And he showed that not only was it perfectly plausible, it was actually able to be done. He was able to shoot an arrow up and then go boing, 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 with a whole bunch of other arrows. He was able to show how dynamically you can move in combat and shoot arrows quickly and rapidly and accurately at flying targets. Like he's diving. There's a YouTube video on this. It showed he basically reconstructed how did they do this. So instead of thinking of it as, oh, this is just medieval tapestry, they didn't know that you're supposed to draw your bow up near your eye so you can be accurate. So they're just showing them shooting from the hip. They're quaint. All these older people didn't know what they were talking about. And then it turns out they knew exactly what they were talking about, and we were being absolute morons, thinking that we knew better. And so, in the same way, sometimes we should actually accept what the story says. Maybe it actually happened, especially when there's all sorts of other stories that go along with this. Think of the Noah's flood as an archetype is found almost universally. Also, when I went to Wind Cave in South Dakota, they talked about the Native Americans and their origin story, like where people came from, where the creator gods made stuff. And it sounds almost exactly like the Garden of Eden, with only a Native American twist, that some of them went out beforehand, before the world was done being created, from this beautiful protective area on its own, and those people, because they went there before the world was finished being made, they were turned into buffalo. And so the buffalo are the brothers and sisters. That's like the only major change. Otherwise, they had a protected area, they were taken care of and had no problems. Then the tempter trickster sent in a coyote, so an animal representative, with food on its back, certain berries and other things, to tempt people to come out. It was literally the Garden of Eden story. But it was the Native American version of creation. It's like, how close do you have to have so many myths come together? So, excuse me if I seem recalcitrant, but I find it odd that one skill most appreciated and rewarded in those circles where one hears everlastingly the inquiring mind and the importance of finding out for one's self is the gift and power of taking things for granted. Even our Latter-day Saint intellectuals are convinced that the way to impress the Gentiles is not to acquire the mastery of their critical tools, how few even know Latin, but simply defer in all things to their opinions. And this is, again, also true of science today. It hasn't gotten any better. There are very few people who actually go and get the know-how to advance things in their actual own way. For example, so Isaac Asimov in the Foundation series, the very first book, which doesn't have a protagonist, it goes through different eras where it's decided to show how civilization crumbles and then can be brought back because of the Foundation. But one of the beginning parts starts in someone's parlor where the galactic world, the galactic human empire is about to fall. And it is a lamentation of the scientist in the parlor of this, regional governor who wants to set up where the scientists and encyclopedists are, that they talk about metadata and meta-analysis, where it's all the scientific papers are just scientific papers about scientific papers about scientific papers, instead of actually going out and doing something new and original. We have that today. So it wasn't a problem just today, it was a problem back then, too. Think back, my good man, to the first act of recorded history. What meets our gaze as the curtain rises? People everywhere building towers. And why are they building towers? To get to heaven. The tower was, to use the Babylonian formula, the Markaz Shamei U Iristim, the binding place of heaven and earth, where alone one could establish contact with the upper and lower worlds. That goes not only for Babylonia, but also for the whole ancient world, as I have pointed out at merciless length in my recent study in the herocentric state. The towers were artificial mountains, as any textbook will tell you, and no temple complex could be without one. The laborers of Dombart, Jeremias, Andre, Burroughs, and others will spare us the pains of showing you these towers scattered everywhere throughout the old world as a means of helping men to get to heaven. The legends concerning them are legion, but they all fall in the same pattern. In the beginning, an ambitious race of men tried to get to heaven by climbing a mountain or tower. They failed, and then set out to conquer the world. As thoroughly typical version of the story variant is found in Jewish and Christian apocryphal writers, in which the sons of Seth, the angels in some versions, eager to regain the paradise Adam had lost, went up on Mount Hermon and lived lives of religious asceticism, calling themselves the Watchers and the sons of Elohim. It was an attempt to establish the heavenly order, and it failed. The embittered colony descended the mountain to break the covenant, marry the daughters of Cain, and beget a race of men notorious for murders and robberies. See the recent book, Gems of Genesis, by Jonah Barnes as well, to explain how terrible this was. And I submit, okay, all this talk about towers really reminds me of the temple. So, to me, it seems like they were all trying to get to heaven. Anyway, determined to possess the earth if they could not possess heaven, and men of the mountain denied that they had failed, faked the priesthood, and forced the inhabitants of the earth to accept the kings they put over them. This story you will recognize as an obvious variant of the extremely ancient and widespread Mad Hunter cycle, which I treated in an article on the origin of the state. The Mad Hunter, you will recall, claimed to be the rightful ruler of the universe, challenged God to an archery contest, and built a great tower from which he hoped to shoot his arrows into heaven. Sir James Frazer has collected a large number of American Indian versions of the story to illustrate old world parallels, for the tale is met with among primitive hunters throughout the world. In Genesis 10, we read that Nimrod, the mighty hunter against the Lord, founded the kingdom of Babel, and in the next chapter that Babel was the name of the tower builded to reach to heaven. This Nimrod seems to be the original archetype of the Mad Hunter. His name is, for the Jews, at all times the very symbol of rebellion against God and of usurped authority. It was who became a hunter of men, established false priesthood and false kingship in the earth in imitation of God's rule, and made all men to sin. A very early Christian writing tells how Noah's descendants waged bitter war among themselves after his death to see who should possess his kingship. Finally, one of the blood of Ham prevailed, and from him the Egyptians, Babylonians, and Persians derived their priesthood and kingship. From the race of Ham, says the text, came one through the magical, as opposed to the holy, succession named Nimrod, who was a giant against the Lord, whom the Greeks call Zoroaster, and who ruled the world, forcing all men by his false magical arts to recognize his authority. The Chronicon Paschal reports a widespread tradition that this giant who built Babylon was not only the first king of Persia, the earthly Cosmocrator, but also the first man to teach the killing and eating of beasts, a belief also expressed in the Quran. Oh, really? The vague before the Lord and the King James Version conceals the true meaning rendered against the Lord by rabbinical and early Christian writers. Interesting. That's the only information besides just references that was in the footnotes. So when they're talking about Nimrod having that name and where it comes from, that was the information in there. Anyways. There is another common tradition that Nimrod's crown was a fake, and that he ruled without right in the earth over all the sons of Noah, and they were all under his power and counsel. He did not go in the ways of the Lord, and was more wicked than all men that were before him. The antiquity of these stories may be judged from an early Babylonian account of a wicked king who first mingled small and great on the mound, and caused them to sin, earning for himself the title of King of the Noble Mound, or the Tower, God of lawlessness, God of no government. In the very earliest Indo-European traditions, this person, Dak, D-A-H-H-A-K, Dak, the type of Dragvant, the man of lie and king of madmen, who sat on throne for 1,000 years and forced all men to subscribe their names in the book of the dragon, thus making them subject to him. This recalls the very ancient tradition that when Seth succeeded Adam in the priesthood, he ordered a special record to be kept, which was called the Book of Life, and which was concealed from the sons of Cain. The dragon's book was an imitation of this. Dude, we're tapping into some old stuff here. There is a constant tendency in the ancient record to confuse Jemshid, the founder of the earthly kingship and the father of the human race, not with Adam, but with the false Adam, or usurper. Ooh. In the Book of Ether, the name Nimrod is attached to the valley which was northward, and which led into that quarter where there never had man been, which suits very well with the legendary character of Nimrod as the mad hunter of the steppes. The name of Nimrod has always baffled philologians, who have never been able to locate it, though Kraling now accepts Edward Mayer's much doubted theory that the name is Egypto-Libyan, which suits well with our own belief regarding the curse of Ham. But at the end of the last century, the explorer and scholar Emin found that name attached to legends, mostly of the Mad Hunter variety, and place names in the region of Lake Van, the Great Valley system due north of Upper Mesopotamia. Now, I'm not interested for a minute, that the legendary Nimrod ever existed. As I told you before, I'm only interested in the type of thing that happened. And after having examined hundreds of legends from all parts of the ancient world, all telling substantially the same story, I think that anyone would find it difficult, in view of the evidence, to deny that there was some common event behind them. It seems to have been a single event, moreover. See, this is what I'm talking about. The preponderance of stories that seem to match. How so? I said above, that we find mounds, towers, and accompanying rituals throughout the whole ancient world. Now, I will go further to say that these mounds and towers, and the great cult complexes that go with them, were not so many independent local inventions, but actually imitations derived ultimately from a single original. Every great national shrine of antiquity had a founding legend of how in the beginning it was brought through the air from some mysterious faraway land, and this faraway land turns out to have been in Central Asia. Our Norse Othin came from the Giants' land to the east, the Greek national cult from the land of Hyperboreans, far to the northeast of Greece. People of the Near East look to a mysterious white mountain of the north as the seat of their primordial cult, the Chinese to the paradise or mountain of the west, and so forth. You may list the various founding legends to trace them back at your leisure to a single point of origin. I find it strange that the founding father and summus deus of each nation of antiquity is somewhere declared to be a fraud and an impostor, a wandering tramp from afar, whose claims to supreme authority cannot stand too careful examination. Think of Prometheus's challenge to Zeus, of Loki's blackmailing of Othin, of dubious justification of Osiris, of the terror of Almighty Anu, when Tiamat challenges his authority, and so forth. Run down these legends, and you will find in every case that the usurper comes from Central Asia. Even Isaiah recalls, that that in the beginning the adversary himself set up his throne upon the mountain of the assembly in the regions of the north, and there pretended to be like the Most High. For all this, a single origin is indicated, whether historical or ritual, makes little difference. There is one aspect of the Nimrod cycle that is too interesting to pass by, especially for an anthropologist. That is the tradition of the stolen garment. We'll stop there. This is fascinating. This is really fascinating. And it is stuff like this that just screams to me, hey, don't you think the Tower of Babel was real? I think so. I think Hugh Nibley's right to sidestep specifics, because the name can change over time. Someone may forget the original name, or it's mispronounced, or they don't know what it means, and so they find another fitting name. And so even if the name Nimrod isn't exactly the actual name of the person, you can still absolutely come to the conclusion that it was meant to be this person here doing these things. I think it's incredible that there are certain consistencies in the legends all around the world. Like I said, North Dakota, the Wind Cave, the story they tell about the origin of the natives. It reads exactly like the Garden of Eden story, with a little bit in the change of the animals. That's it. Showing a little more deference towards the buffalo, but otherwise, pretty dang much the same. And there's stories of the similar thing about the flood. Just you can sit there and think about it localized, but how does it happen constantly and continually all over the world? Did they all locally have a flood? So it's just incredible, Take it for what you will. You get to be the judge. But to me, it all points to the idea that these archetypes, these fables, all point to the same type of story, and that same type of story probably has all the same sort of truth. There's an anime that I really liked that got cut short. It was called Gate. And so the Japanese Self-Defense Force fought. And the idea is that there is a gate that opens up in the middle of Japan, in like downtown Japan. And through the gate comes an army of medieval soldiers and goblins and dragons and stuff. So these ogres in armor and these guys that come in on a horseback, like centurions from Rome almost, and dragons from the sky with lances come through, and they just start massacring people in Japan. And so they, of course, eventually fight back and quell the army. And because of that, you see this slow move of the army being called up, the reservists being drafted in. One of the people, the person that you're following, he was there during that and saved a lot of people by having them enter the Japanese Imperial Palace and keep them safe. And he was called a hero, gets a big promotion, and so he gets to be one of the first people to go through to go to the other side. Well, they go to the other side, and it's this hill, and it has these great plinths and kind of Greek architecture, and they go through and they establish their base around this hill, and it's called Arnaldus Hill in the anime. And so it just progresses from there. They start basically establishing this base around this hill, modern military versus ancient military, but more importantly, since they beat these armies at the hill, they then start going out and doing missions of peace. They want to basically be able to grab the resources from here that they're not using, since it's kind of an extension of Japan at this point, and it's just how the modern military would work and absolutely demolish anyone who got in their way, but more importantly, how they would try and build relations. But it's really funny because the idea is that all these different civilizations, all these anime tropes are in there. You know, there's elves, there's dragons, there's wizards, there's all these anime tropes are in there. And what's funny is that one of the characters is supposed to be this really old person who's really young looking. Again, another trope. But she tasked this lady to figure something out. And she said, go trace where all these different cultures, all these different species of people, trace their origins. And they all pointed towards this Arnaldus Hill. And so, you know, in the same way, what's funny is Hugh Nibley basically said, look, you know, here's this work of fiction that perfectly mirrors what Hugh Nibley is making a point of, is that the origin of all these different cultures point to Central Asia as there being where the Tower of Babylon would, or the Tower of Babel would be. That it would have been where Nimrod was after the flood. And so it's the same justification of, hey, they're all saying they have these different myths, but they all point in this direction. And it's just fascinating, because that's really what would kind of happen, wouldn't it? Anyways, I hope you guys have a great Sunday, and may God be with you.